that will do so. And you flew in from Chicago, right?
Yes, I'm flying back.
Today. Oh, well, thank you for joining us today. I'm Stephen Bartkus, the curator of the Gunn Historical Museum. We have a very special guest with us today, Steve Jones. He flew in from Chicago to give this presentation about the Bulls Bridge to Waterbury power line in Washington, Connecticut. Steve grew up in Naugatuck, the product of two ancient Yankee families from New England, starting in 1640 in Salem and New Haven, Connecticut. Initially wanting to be a lineman for CLNP, he attended Western New England College and started in electrical engineering. After discovering math was not his strong suit, he switched to industrial engineering and ultimately to occupational safety and ergonomics. The lure of power lines never left him, though, and he has continued to be interested in early power history, especially the development of electrical insulators over the past 40 years. So please join me in welcoming Steve Jones here today.
All right, let's see if the loud. Is that too loud? No. All right. We'll see how this goes. I talk loudly anyway, so hopefully I won't scream your ears off. All right. So, like Stephen said, sure this isn't too loud? Get away from that mic. All right. I have sciatica, so I might be sitting and standing during this. Is that better? Can you still hear me? Yes. Yes? All right. We're good.
Okay.
All right. We'll go. Anyway, so talked about background already. Yeah, we're going to spend the next 45, 50 minutes or so talking about the Bulls Bridge to Waterbury power line that ran through southeastern Washington, southern Washington. Specifically, this has been a topic I've been researching through my hobby. You know, one of my side hobbies is insulator collecting, and so I've kind of been pursuing it through that avenue for the last 6-7 years. So kind of give you my journey through how I researched it, where it ran, and then finally, once I was able to locate it, what types of things we've been able to find along it. So I'm going to cover a little bit of everything. But first, I'm going to get a little bit into the history of hydroelectric power. As we know, New England was a center for the Industrial Revolution in the US. We borrowed some technology from the English in the early 1800s, and New England lent itself very well to the establishment and use of water power. We have relatively compact geography, a couple hundred miles between the mountains and the ocean, so we have swift-flowing rivers with lots of drops in elevation, so it made it very easy to put up a dam, set up a water wheel, and generate mechanical power to run a mill or machinery, grinding wheels, etc. So once electricity came around, and about the late 1870s, early 1800s, a few people in the US, and Connecticut included, decided to set up a dynamo or a generator onto their water wheels and generate electricity. So the potential is very high in New England, always has been, and there's still a lot of active hydropower projects in place now. So the leap to hydroelectric power from hydromechanical power was a natural one in New England. The first utility in Connecticut to take advantage of hydroelectric power was Hartford Electric Light. They built a dam in Rainbow in 1893. The president of Helco was A.C. Dunham at the time, and his father, Austin Dunham, ran the Willimantic Linen Company in Willimantic. And they were the first ones in the state, and actually in the country, to put a dynamo on their existing water wheel, and they generated electricity for their mill to set up 6 carbon arc lights. So it became the world's first electrically lit linen mill at that point. And when they built a second mill a few years later, they wired it from the get-go for electricity, which was the first mill building to be wired for electricity from the start. So
I'm sorry, you said carbon arc. Is that direct current or alternating current?
carbon
At
arc
that
is
time.
direct current
That's
at
what I
that
thought.
time. Yeah.
So at that time, they were generating direct current?
Direct current.
They
Yeah.
were? Oh.
Yeah. A dynamo generates direct current, and a
Oh.
generator generates alternating current.
Okay.
Yeah, at this point in the game, everything was DC.
Oh, see.
Yeah, AC came on the scene in the mid 1800s, I mean
Oh.
1880s.
Okay.
Yeah. So, anyway, so they had that experience in Willimantic. AC Dunham became the president of Helco a few years later, and he said, "Hey, it worked great in Willimantic. We want to use hydroelectric power for Hartford Electric Light too, because they had a steam generator, like most plants at that time, utilities at that time." So the problem was Helco was in its infancy. It was a very new company. It was still competing against Hartford Gas Light for the street lighting contracts in Hartford, so they didn't have any money, no capitalization. So AC turned to his college buddy from Yale, Edward Terry, who was the grandson of Eli Terry, the clockmaker from Terryville, Bristol, and he said, "Hey, how would you like to set up a hydroelectric venture?" So Edward purchased some land up on the Farmington River in Windsor, in the Rainbow section, by Pequannock, kind of across the river from Bradley Airport. And they threw up a woodlog dam, put up a wooden powerhouse, and they named the outfit Farmington River Power Company. And so Helco didn't own it, but they bought all the electricity from there. And so the 500 volts DC was transmitted 10 miles south to Hartford, and Hartford Electric Light became the beneficiary of that electricity. So they were able to lower their rates, put the gas company out of business, and start growing as a utility. And that was done in 1893. So that was the first power project in Connecticut on a commercial scale. It was DC, like I said originally, 500 volts. Within 2 years, AC, alternating current, had taken off to the point where they installed a 3-phase AC generator at Rainbow, and it became like this big hotbed of experimentation on the planet. There was only one other project in the works at that time in Laufen, Germany. So this is one of 2 AC plants in the world. So Hartford Electric Light was pretty groundbreaking at that point. Helco, able to use hydroelectric power, was able to drop their rates, start to build the business, and by a few years later, 1899, they were building their own plant 3 miles upstream on the Farmington in the Terriffill section of Simsbury. That became groundbreaking because it was the first transmission line at 11,000 volts, 3-phase AC, first transmission line to use aluminum conductors anywhere on the planet. So most people use copper or iron, they use aluminum. So that became first in the world to do that. So Connecticut's had some pretty trailblazing power projects. So Helco had those 2 dams early on. So everyone's seeing this around the state and they're saying, "Hey, well, if Helco can do it, why can't we do it?" So they're chartering all sorts of projects around the state. So in the Housatonic, Bulls Bridge plant came along first in 1903. Falls Village up in Canaan came around 1914. And then Rocky River Power Company, closer to New Milford, was chartered in 1917, but didn't get fully developed and turned on until 1928. Rocky River was the first pumped storage hydroelectric plant in the United States. There was only one other in Switzerland at that time, that's it. So pumped storage means you pump water upstream, pull it out of the river at night, pump it up into a basin. That basin is now Candlewood Lake. And then by daytime, you let the water flow back down and it turns the turbines and generates electricity. So again, another groundbreaking project in Connecticut. So those were all built. Then when Connecticut Light and Power was formed a few years later, they built Stevenson Dam down between Monroe and Oxford in 1919. That formed Lake Zor. And then they built the Chepaug Dam in Southbury in 1955, and that formed Lake Lilanona. So 5 active power projects just on the Housatonic, just in Connecticut alone. And those are all still active today. They're all still being used, so it's pretty groundbreaking for the time. So we're going to focus on Bulls Bridge because that's the subject of the talk here. So Bulls Bridge was actually chartered in 1893, but being, the financial panics being what they were, they didn't really have enough capitalization to get started on building the project until spring of 1902. They finally could start surveying and start digging up the ground there. But in 1893, they were given a charter. The state created New Milford Power Company, chartered them, and they were granted power to acquire all such land and real estate that was necessary or convenient for the development of water power on the Housatonic River, at or near Bulls Falls, Gaylord Bridge, or Lover's Leap. So pretty broad charter there. So they started that in 1902. So that became the first on the Housatonic. So if you're going to build a large-scale hydroelectric power plant, obviously you need a customer to sell that electricity to. Where'd my water go? And it was not New Milford. At the same time, over in Waterbury, the Connecticut Railway and Lighting Company was forming. They were building the trolley systems in Waterbury and the Naugatuck Valley, and they subscribed to about, I think it was 3,000 horsepower, about 4 megawatts electricity from the dam. So the problem was they had a customer, but the customer was 26 miles away. These days, 26-mile power line is, walk in the park, no big deal. But back in 1903, that was pushing the envelope big time. There were only a couple other big power projects in place at that time, mostly out in California, a couple in Colorado. So 26 miles away was a pretty big distance. There was a rule of thumb in electrical engineering then, as there is now. For every mile of transmission line you need at least 1,000 volts potential to make sure the electricity is going to get to the other end of the line and not burn up in the resistance of the wires. So 26 miles meant they had to have a potential of at least 26,000 volts. They picked 33.5 as their voltage. It was pretty much what the standard equipment of the time could generate and transform to. It's still kind of a standard voltage even today, 33.5, 34. So they picked 33.5. So when they did that, it became the highest voltage line, and it became the longest distance line in the United States up till that point, east of the Rocky Mountains. There were 2 projects in California that generated electricity in the Sierra Nevada and shipped it 100 miles into Sacramento and then to San Francisco. That was in place about a year or 2 earlier, and then several projects in Colorado to generate electricity. The first hydropower station in the US that generated AC was actually at Ames in Colorado next to Telluride. And they generated power for the Gold King mine in the mountains above Telluride and greatly dropped the price of mining and processing gold and silver. So those 2 projects were in place when Bulls Bridge was proposed. So 33,500 volts at that time was a huge voltage. The problem, even though they could generate and they had motors and they had switches and fuses and lightning arresters and all that stuff was commercially developed already. The problem was the insulation for the line. Insulators were in their infancy. They kind of got dragged along with as the rest of the technology outpaced them. Up until this point, most insulators were glass in the United States. They were for telephone and telegraph use, meaning about 100 volts potential. And they didn't really understand the material characteristics, the design, the shape, nothing. So they're starting from scratch. So it's very much baptism by fire, trial and error in the insulator industry at that point. So these voltages are getting proposed bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and they basically just flew by the seat of their pants what these insulators needed to look like and what they needed to be made from. So initially they just took glass insulators and they made them bigger and bigger and bigger until they started to figure out, hey, glass isn't always a good insulator. It's not mechanically strong, especially out in the elements. We keep throwing rocks at insulators or lightning or anything like that. They started to make insulators out of porcelain pretty early on, around 1890. Porcelain at that time, they didn't have vacuum pug mills. So any porcelain they made that was thicker than a ½ inch was usually riddled with air bubbles, so it would explode in the kiln. If it got out of the kiln, they would cement it together, throw it in the field, and say, here's an insulator, quick, use it before something happens. So the insulator industry was very much in its infancy, and you've heard, at the time anyway, there were a lot of stories about leakage current, insulators exploding, puncturing, all sorts of fun stuff. So like, say, Edison system in Manhattan, they ran the wires overhead, couple hundred volts DC. In a rainstorm, if the insulator isn't designed well, what can happen is the water starts to, wets the insulator, and then the current from the wire starts to leak down through the wet surface of the insulator into the pin that it sits on, through the crossarm, down the pole, and into the ground. So that's what they call leakage current. Sometimes that leakage current was enough that someone would be walking down the street, step in a puddle in a rainstorm next to a pole and zzz, or kabam, and someone is electrocuted. So naturally, that makes the headlines. So people are very nervous about high voltage. So these voltage, 50,000 volts, 60,000 volt, people are like, they're not really thrilled when these companies come knocking on the door. So, did I skip one? No, all right, good. So, anyway, Bulls Bridge is being surveyed, it's being built, they're proposing the power line. New Milford Power Company is out knocking on doors across the countryside between here and Waterbury. Hey, do you mind if we run a high voltage power line through your property? What do you think the response was? Yeah, no, go find someone else. So there were a lot of mixed feelings. There were a lot of people in the area say, hey, this is the biggest project in the East Coast. It's the biggest one ever built, highest voltage. This is cool. We're going to get tourism, people coming here from all over the world to look at us, and that's pretty interesting. But again, you had the flip side, where a lot of people just refused to sell property to New Milford Power Company because they don't want their animals getting electrocuted or their family getting electrocuted or things exploding and other things like that. A lot of people in New Milford were also rightfully ticked off that the electricity was going to Waterbury and not to New Milford. So New Milford, they're burning oil and gas lamps, while Waterbury, everyone's riding around in electric trolleys. So then as now, Waterbury takes from Litchfield County and doesn't give a lot back, especially water from the Chepaug. So anyway, a lot of anger about that. And then finally, once the power line was built, it had problem after problem after problem after problem, and so forth. So anyway, the power line, as they built it, it was built in duplicate, meaning two sets of poles. Each pole had a three-phase circuit, AC circuit at 33,000 volts on it. And they used glass insulators that were supplied by C.S. Knowles of Boston. C.S. Knowles was kind of like the Walmart, I guess, of the time. If you wanted anything trolley, you called up C.S. Knowles in Boston and said, okay, I need catenary, I need insulators, poles, pins, whistle stop signs, brakes for the trolleys, motors, whatever. You ordered it from C.S. Knowles. So they said, we're building this power line. They shipped them a bunch of glass insulators. So it was predicted the line was going to be partially switched on and tested early in 1904, and then fully up and running by summer of 1904. So, but like I said, the problems commenced. So part of the information I got from Stephen here, he sent me a little snippet when I first contacted him, an article called Electricity in Washington, which turns out is from a larger book called An American Village, The Light at the North End of the Tunnel, which is written completely about Washington Depot. So really neat source if you haven't seen it. A few little juicy tidbits in that article, so I figured I'd share at least one of them with you in the gray box at the top. Nice little legal ad here from, actually the Litchfield Inquirer is the source. Notice, all persons justly aggrieved over whose lands or lands adjoining thereto the electric lines of New Milford Power Company are run, are requested to communicate promptly with W.S. Ford in Washington or Edward Van Ingen in New York. And I'll give you one guess what their occupation was. Yeah. Lawyers are involved already, so lawsuits already. The people in Milford must have been really, really ticked off. On top of that, and I apologize for this font, and I tried to blow up 2-point font from an electrical trade journal and make it readable, so I'll read it. By May of 1904, this news snippet appears in the Electrical World Trade Journal, barely 2 months after the line was turned on. And I'll read it for you. Waterbury. The New Milford Power Company, which transmits power from Bulls Bridge to Waterbury for use by CR&L, has had in this section of line to change all of the glass insulators to porcelain insulators with much more satisfactory results. And then notes that the line's being extended up through Cheshire to New Britain to service the trolley lines up there. They're building substations. So the line is barely on 2 months and all of the glass insulators have failed at 33,000 volts. You can imagine what that looked like if you lived by the power line. So again, not very confidence building for New Milford Power Company. So C.S. Knowles was contacted. I don't know if they were phoned or telegraphed. Maybe they sent someone up on a horse, I don't know. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall for that conversation. Yeah, hello C.S. Knowles, all of your insulators failed. We need better insulators. So they shipped porcelain and they replaced all 26 miles of line. It must have been in a matter of weeks. because they were losing money. So C.S. Knowles substituted the porcelain insulators. But that still didn't fix a lot of the problems, because in 1908 there's another nice news snippet in the Electrical World Trade Journal that in Waterbury they were building another steam generating plant in 1908 specifically to back up the power line because it was that unreliable. So you didn't want to be an electrical operator in 1904, obviously. Then, because we have to have more fun, on the corporate front, just as much chaos. In 1906, the New Haven Railroad comes snooping around. Charles Mellon was going about consolidating everything in Connecticut under their thumb, so they purchased Connecticut Railway and Lighting in Waterbury. So apparently when they did that, along with that came New Milford Power Company. So now New Haven Railroad operates the power line. Next, New Haven Railroad purchased Housatonic Power Company in Canaan in 1911. There is a note, New Milford Power did manage to do an upgrade to the power plant in 1912. There's another book written about that. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head here, but someone wrote a nice big book about the upgrade. So by 1912, they were finally, 9 years later, after able to supply electricity to New Milford and Gaylordsville and Kent and the surrounding towns. So that kind of quelled some of the anger after that. Somewhere around 1914, and I couldn't find an exact reference, I only saw it alluded to in a few news articles, New Haven Railroad divested itself of its generation assets around 1914, and it kept the transportation assets because it was a railroad, it wasn't a power company. So those were split off, so they're free-floating again. But that didn't stop the chaos. 1915, New Milford Power sold out to Housatonic Power. And then 2 years later, in 1917, Housatonic turns around and sells everything to Rocky River Power Company. So on that same date, Rocky River changes its name to Connecticut Light and Power, the same corporate entity we have today under the name Eversource Connecticut. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. So CLMP is now in control. 1918-ish, they went about connecting everything together. They were actually one of the first utilities in the country to go connect everything together, make a grid, a regional grid. So they started connecting Bulls Bridge to Rocky River. They built a branch line over to Pauling, New York through a median. They sold electricity to some of the towns over around Pauling. And they also built a connecting line from New Britain, the other end of their line, up to the Dutch Point steam plant in Hartford, connecting to Helco. There's a lot of references over the years about how notoriously bad New Britain had it from an electricity standpoint. It got to the point where Stanley Works in New Britain was so fed up with CLMP, they actually bought Farmington River Power Company, the dam at Rainbow, and they rerouted the power line to New Britain, and they took 100% electricity off that dam, and they still own that to this day. They still own Farmington River Power Company. So CLMP was notoriously unreliable in New Britain. So they connected to Helco as backup. And then a few years later, Helco actually connected up to United Electric in Springfield, which was the country's first interstate power pool agreement. There was the foundation for Connecticut Valley Electric Exchange in Southington, which is still there and manages all the electricity throughout New England from one little control room in Southington, underground, and it's atomic bomb proof. I got to tour that in college. Yeah, it's not nuclear proof, it's just an atomic bomb because it was the 50s. So that's interesting. So that was the beginning of convex. So this was really the first area of the country where we had a regional grid set up right off the bat, 1918 or so. So again, some more groundbreaking work for CLMP. Around this time, and I'm guessing 1918, based on what I've seen along the line, they upgraded the power line. If you're going to connect everything together and everything's going to be dependent on other power plants statewide, obviously the power lines need to be up to snuff. So they did what we today call line hardening, which is what CLMP is doing now after the recent storms of the last 5 years. So the insulators, the porcelain insulators, were replaced with better quality porcelain insulators made by Ohio Brass Company, which is still in business under the name Hubbell. It's one of the Hubbell companies. And then the wood pins were replaced with iron. Now, if you look at a pole, you've got the power pole and you've got a cross arm on the top of the pole. These days they use steel, but back then they used wood dowels. that stuck up, and it had a screw thread carved in the top, and you screwed the insulator onto that pin to hold it in place, and then you tied the wire to the top of the insulator. So the insulators went, the pins went, iron got put in, better insulators on the top, so they line hardened the entire line over to Waterbury. So that helped a little bit, I'm assuming, because it lasted at least another 10 years. So in that book, An American Village, Light at the North End of the Tunnel, there's a couple news notes in there. One of them is they actually tapped the Bulls Bridge line at Washington Depot in 1921 to supply electricity for Washington Depot. Up until that point, starting in 1901, there was a gentleman in Washington Depot. He wanted electricity desperately for Washington Depot, which was then called Factory Hollow. So he purchased a used generator from Grannis and Elmore up on West Street in Bantam, dragged it down the road, set it up in a house here on the south side of the river, south bank of the river, right about where 47 crosses now. And they generated electricity using a gas-powered generator right up until 21. So 1901 to 1921, exactly 20 years.
Was that Joseph West? Was that Joseph West?
Um,
Did that, or do you know?
I don't have the name
Okay.
handy, sorry. No, it says West Street Bantam. Grannis and Elmore was the company. So they bought it, he got it used. But it is in that book. 1905, Litchfield Electric Light Company had gotten big enough, they kind of absorbed Washington into their service territory. So Washington Depot, from 1905 on, was served by Loco, and Loco operated that gas generator until 1921 when they said, all right, enough of the generator, let's tap into the power line that's already there. So they started that. Now, when this line was actually decommissioned is still a mystery. I don't know if, we know Eversource and CLMP and Northeast Utilities and whatever they want to call themselves today.
First Light,
What?
First Light, I think they're called.
Oh, the dam, yeah, the generation point, yeah, since they divested. Well, Eversource, I'm trying to find archives, and they're not very big on sharing information. So we've actually sent a few people, friends of mine, Zach, who was supposed to do the talk, he actually showed up in Berlin at the front desk and said, I'd like to see the archives, and they said, no, you're not coming in. So I've had to estimate through other sources when this line was actually decommissioned. I'm guessing around 1930. The big reason I'm guessing that is because I know by 1934, the modern power line that's down by the Roxbury town line now was in place. That right-of-way was built. So between 30 and 34, that line that's there now was the replacement for the original Bulls Bridge line. And the only reason I figured that out is because one of the articles from one of the trade journals had photos of the line in Washington, and it wasn't where it is now. So that's really what kind of prompted this whole search to think, okay, where would this line originally run if it wasn't where it is now? So anyway, so I know by 1934 the modern line was there. So around 1930, so 1904 to 1930, never really got out of its troubled adolescent period. This line was a constant problem from day one, and continued that way at least through the next 20 years. So a very tortured history, very sad history. So ever since then, it's been smooth sailing since they upgraded the line. So that begs the question, if it didn't run where it ran now, where did it run? So I start searching through whatever I can find. Trade journals were very big at the time. Every major electrical power project was written up in extreme detail in a trade journal. So some of those are the Electrical World, the Electrical Engineer, American Electrician, the Electric Railway Journal. Two of those, American Electrician wrote a big article about the Bulls Bridge project in 1904, and Electric Railway Journal wrote it up again in 1913 with photos, which is great. So those are very good sources of information. But very seldom do they publish any detailed maps about where the line ran. And for Bulls Bridge, neither article told where it ran. It just said, oh, it goes over to Waterbury. So you start tapping local resources. So contacted Gunn here amongst some of the other historical societies, New Milford, Gaylordsville, Woodbury, Bethlehem, anyone I could grab onto. And Stephen is the only one that replied. So hence why I'm here today and not in Woodbury or Gaylordsville or New Milford. So he found the article, Electricity in Washington. He also contacted Town Hall down here in the depot, and they produced 2 letters asking the same question: where did this line run? One of them was, we have a record of this line in Washington, but we went out to look for it and we can't find it. 1954. Second one was, I think, one of the historical commissions was, we understand there was this early historic power line that ran through Washington. What can you tell us about it? And in both instances, it was almost a form letter. It came back, yes, there was an early historic line that ran through Washington. It was, 33,000 volts from Bullsbridge, 26 miles over to Waterbury for the trolley system, and it used aluminum conductors and glass insulators. Period. Sincerely yours, such and such, seal and pay. So no information where it ran. So that's the PR department, I guess. Very cool information to have, but again, didn't really dial in where this was. The breaking point, the alleluia moment, came for me about 2 years ago. Yukon apparently, excuse me 1 second. Don't want to cough in the microphone. Yukon apparently has been sitting on this photographic archive of the 1934 Connecticut Aerial Photographic Survey, thousands of photos. They flew a plane over Connecticut in 1934 and took a picture every few miles. So they scanned all that, put it up on their website in a searchable index, so you can see what the state looked like from above in 1934. So I found that, and kaboom, the heavens opened up, the angels started singing, the trumpets are blaring. I was able to finally locate where these photos I had found were taken. No more guessing. So I'll show you that in a second. For power lines, insulator hunting, if you know any linemen, CLP linemen in this case, 40 years ago for Bulls Bridge, that probably would have been a better resource. Now, not many people are left unless information got passed down through families saying, oh yeah, I remember Grandpa saying he used to work a pole and a squirrel electrocuted itself out on, Nickel Hill Road, blah, 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 blah. I haven't been able to find any locals to talk to me yet. So if you're local and you have information, please let me know. You might get a homework assignment. But anyway, local contacts are good. CLMP linemen, sometimes electrical contractors are out walking the line, they're repairing something and they step on a glass insulator. What's that doing here? It's like, really, where was that? And you write down the information. So that's helped me on a few lines in Connecticut, just not Bulls Bridge. Photos and postcards. There is a huge market for antique postcards. If you didn't know that already, you know it now. Turn of the last century, they would take a picture of anything and put it on a postcard. So, oh look, daffodils on New Haven Road in Naugatuck. Well, put it on a postcard. So everything. So I found a nice postcard of the Bulls Bridge plant, taken right around 1903, 1904, because it shows the power line leaving the plant with very large glass insulators on it. So that means it was before May of 1904. So that was a very nice score there. Photos, my family's not from this area, we're from Naugatuck, but if your family's been in this area a long time, you have an old family photo album, and they took pictures around Steep Rock or anywhere along the line, as we'll see in a minute, and it shows a power line in the background. I will be your new best friend. So if you have a family photo album, please search through it. So photos are an excellent resource. And then finally, it's just plain old dumb luck. You're just wandering through the woods, you're on a blue blaze trail, you're out doing some hiking or something, all of a sudden there's a pole stump or an insulator or a cross arm or something just sitting in the woods there, and you're like, what on earth is that doing here? And you start walking it and you find out, hey, there was an entire line here at one point. So that's happened to me a few places. My own property back in Naugatuck, the New York to Boston AT&T toll line, the middle route, there were 3 routes, 3 lines that ran between New York and Boston. 50 wires on the pole. That ran through our property in Naugatuck, and I didn't even know until my father inadvertently mentioned it one day while we're up there, and he already knew I collected insulators. But, oh, by the way, the phone line ran through here. Well, gee, thanks, Dad. So we managed to find it that way. So there's plenty of different ways to find that. But anyway, so the 1934 Connecticut Aerial Photographic Survey was my saving grace. The only map I had up till that point, this was published in the 1913 article in Electric Railway Journal, and it shows an extraordinarily crude general direction of the line. So starts in New Milford, it does go southeast, then cuts across east straight to around, I'm guessing, the Abbey in Bethlehem, cuts down through Middlebury to Bunker Hill, Waterbury, and then to downtown Waterbury. But no details, no villages, no hamlets, no towns, no landmarks, nothing. So at one point I actually took the modern Connecticut map, tried to match it up to this, match the rivers up to see if I could get anything to align, and that was an exercise in futility. So that was my only information to go on for about 3 years until this came out. So the 34 aerial photographic survey comes out. So I start looking, type in Washington, what pops up? Vroom, takes me right in. Now I knew from the article, the original 1904 article, that the right-of-way would be, for the power line, would be at least 45 feet wide. The article very specifically says the double pole line, the poles were 25 feet apart with 10 feet on either side for right-of-way clearance. So it's a very wide right-of-way for that era. Most telegraph right-of-ways are about 10 feet, if that. Most dirt roads at that time were about 10 feet. So I know I'm looking for something fairly big. So this popped out. This is Walker Brook and Walker Brook Road, still a dirt road. This is Shiner Mountain Road. And then this is the west side of the clamshell in Steep Rock with the hemlock forest there. So you can see a few things jump right out here. It's like, here's an extraordinarily wide swath of clearing going up the hillside over to New Milford. Huh, that's interesting, write it down. Follow that up later. Another piece over here. So eventually you start seeing enough of these sections, you start to connect the dots and put two and two together. In 1937, I think most people don't realize at the turn of the century, last century, 1900, 1890, Connecticut was almost like 80% cleared. There was very little woods in Connecticut. It was almost all farms and fields. So it took a long time for that to grow back. So by 1934, there was still a lot of open farmland, especially in Litchfield County. And in Middlebury, it's been very difficult to try to figure out where this line ran because it's all open fields still, and you can't see on these photos where it ran exactly until you see something like this. So this is on the west side of the clamshell. Yes?
I'm sorry, could you go back? And what's in the middle? That's not Walker Brook Road, is it?
This is Walker Brook here and Walker Brook Road,
Okay,
and then this is Shiner Mountain Road. This is,
okay.
that's the Chappaq
Yeah,
River,
thank
the
you.
clamshell,
Sorry.
yeah, in
Sorry.
Steep Rock. Yeah. Okay. So this is the east side of the clamshell. And here's the photo from the 1913 article. That was the only major clue I had to go on up to that point. Now the article specifically says the line was built in duplicate, 2 sets of poles, except for 13 poles in the town of Washington where they had to use single poles because of right-of-way problems. So this is where one of the big battles occurred, right in the middle of the Steep Rock Reservation. So they had to build around. Looking at this section, I'm an engineer, my brother's a surveyor. We know most property lines are going to be right angles. So you see the rectangles here, you know that's a field or a stone wall or something like that. So you can kind of trace that out in the woods. Here's the Chappaq River. Here's the Chappaq Railroad, still in place. And then here is Tunnel Road that runs down. So there's a couple things that kind of pop out. Right here, a narrow right-of-way or a narrow clearing. And then here's a slightly wider one, but with a 120-degree jog in the middle of the woods for no apparent reason. So I think, that's interesting. This photo is from the 1913 article, and it shows very clearly a railroad crossing and a flat dirt road going off in the distance. And here's the double pole line, the single, 2 circuits on 1 pole, the single pole line here. So I knew that was somewhere in Washington, somewhere around the Chappaq Railroad, because that's the only railroad in Washington. But what I couldn't figure out is where is there a flat, level stretch of road that runs east-west in Washington? There ain't none. Yeah, because the whole Chappaq Valley looks like this. So for years I couldn't figure this out. Then I finally see this photo, and then I start to put 2 and 2 together. So this is a narrow right-of-way. That was probably the single pole stretch, part of it. And then you see right here is a nice little neat intersection of a railroad and a flat level road. Like, this is getting good. And then you see that, all of a sudden it jumps up out of the woods here, goes up over onto Curtis Road, and then up behind the American Indian Archaeological Institute. So very quickly the pieces fell into place here. So I'm like, okay, now I see where this line could have run. The photographer was obviously standing right here at the intersection and taking a picture looking up the road. So the line came down the hill from the top of the clamshell, followed Tunnel Road about 3,000 feet, and then jumped up the hillside onto Curtis Road and then followed it east from there. So again, the angels came out, the horns are going off, the trumpets are sounding, everything is lining up. So I'm very familiar with Steep Rock. My father brought my brother and I over here from Naugatuck in 1981 to walk through the tunnel. And it was also, back in the day, one of my grandfather's secret fishing spots. So my father knew Steep Rock, so now we know Steep Rock. So I knew exactly where this was. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna drive from Chicago and check this out. So 2 years ago I did, and found out, yes, indeed, this is where the line ran. So, putting all the dots together, this is the original route of the power line before they moved it. So, came over the hill from New Milford, crossed Walker Brook and Shiner Mountain, went around the top of the clamshell, crossed the river at the railroad crossing, followed Tunnel Road, I think about 3,000 feet, turned right, jumped up the hill, up behind the Indian Institute, got onto Curtis Road, and then followed Nichols Hill Road, all the way across to West Mountain Road, and then into Bethlehem. So once it hit that nice east-west road, it had a clear shot. So if you live anywhere near this, you're gonna get a homework assignment. I'm gonna wanna talk to you. So anyway, so this is the original line. The green line here is where it runs currently. It's a much straighter line. The problem being it crosses the river down by the Roxbury Town line, and the valley looks like this. So here's the river, here's the tracks, here's the road. In no way matched any of the photos that I had. So that's what drove me to figure it ran somewhere else originally. So that's where it ran in the town of Washington. So these are some pictures from the articles that I had. This is the 1913 single pole segment photo that I had with the railroad crossing. You can see the poles aren't exactly pretty. Most things around 1903, you could buy cross arms, you could buy insulators, you could buy wire, brackets, all that fun stuff, but very few people sold poles. So 9 times out of 10, the local project was built using local timber. So it says right in the article they used native chestnut for the power line. So they went into the woods, found the tallest trees they could, cut them down, stripped the bark and the branches, and they stuck them in the ground, untreated poles. Now they're basically dust. So they're not very straight, they're not very pretty, but they serve their purpose. So those went right into the ground. So that's what the double pole section looked like. This is more typically what it looked like, the double pole section here. It had an insulator at the top, and 5 feet down, there was a 5-foot cross arm with an insulator on each end of that. And wherever it was on a corner or a long span with extra tension in the wire, they would double up the insulators, double up the cross arms. So that's more typically what the line looked like.
Did they also brace them?
Yes. Let me check. Yeah, if you notice, there's what we call push poles. The linemen will call these push poles or stub guys or something. Very little guy wire. Typically on a power line, if you're going to turn a corner, they'll run a stranded steel cable down to the ground into an anchor and hold the pole in place. It must have been a lot cheaper to just use extra timber than to run steel guy wire and try to dig a hole for an anchor. So yeah, almost all the photos show these push poles everywhere. So again, untreated chestnut. So this picture here shows the line. This is the double pole segment coming into Waterbury. That's the Waterbury substation, number 1. That is on Freight Street. That's where the current CLMP office is right now. So right behind the photographer is the Naugatuck River. It had just jumped the river and went a couple poles further into the substation here. So this is the Bulls Bridge line here. And then this here, the single pole, is the extension up to New Britain. That was built 2 circuits, but they used 1 pole instead of 2. They probably learned their lesson on the right-of-way from trying to build from Bulls Bridge, so they said, okay, screw it, we'll just do a nice narrow right-of-way and have fewer problems building the line. So that was the line outbound, all porcelain insulators. So that's after the substitution. This is a picture of the Bulls Bridge plant where the line started at the powerhouse. So 2 circuits, 2 sets of poles, very clearly shows 3-piece porcelain insulators in use. So this is after the big change out. And then here's a blow up from the postcard that I found. This is the back of the plant. Here's the line to Waterbury starting. This is a line that ran up the hill to the gatehouse for some control circuitry.
Where exactly is compared to say where the bridge is now?
Where the powerhouse is now? Or?
Yeah, where's the powerhouse?
The powerhouse is in exactly the same location.
Gaylorsville.
Yeah,
But in reference to
Bulls
the
Bridge,
bridge,
Gaylorsville,
yes.
above Gaylorsville, about 2-3 miles.
Not even that far.
Yeah.
A mile maybe.
Yeah, if you're going on 7, you'll see a canal and you'll go underneath on a bridge, and then it'll go down the hill, and there's a driveway there, and it has the fence, and it says Bulls Bridge Power Station, which is now First Light, you said?
Yeah.
It's no longer CLMP.
Yeah, I'll tell you about it.
I sense a story coming up. All right, so anyway, so very clearly this shows very large glass insulators on the poles. So you know this was right before they turned the line on, so that was a very good photo to find, or postcard to find. So that begs the question, wow, that almost makes the insulator look purple. Wouldn't that be nice, John? There you go. What was used on the line? Well, I've walked myself about 10 of the 26 miles where I could without getting shot or trespassing or whatever. There's a lot of stretches that are actually along the modern power line, which makes it nice for access. So I've been able and very extraordinarily lucky to find pieces of some of the original insulators in certain spots, usually on corners, bottoms of hills, in a gully, wherever like that. So I've been able to put together a good specimen of each one. Very fortunate to have done that. So the glass insulator was sold by C.S. Knowles. C.S. Knowles was a seller, they were not a manufacturer, so they actually jobbed out or contracted out most of their insulators. So the glass insulators we know were made by Novelty Glass down in Elmer, New Jersey, around the big cluster of South Jersey glass houses. So the insulator here, kind of a unique shape, an umbrella shape with a very long bottom skirt. On every single one of them, very prominently, is their patent date, June 17th, 1890. There's also kind of a, it's hard to see here, it's a raised, what looks to be a square gemstone. That was their trademarked name called Prism. So all of their insulators, the glass insulators, were marked with that Prism, embossed right on the insulator, with that patent date. Now, like I said, the insulator industry in 1890 was in its infancy. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know how to design an insulator for these voltages, so it was very much trial and error. So any incremental improvement or perceived improvement to an insulator was patented to death. So there are something like 20,000 insulator patents filed between 1890 and 1930, and it still continues today. Crazy. And then if they saw another company even slightly copied their design, it was lawsuited to death. So it was extremely litigious back then, because again, they didn't know what they were doing. So June 17th, 1890 actually covers the design of the crown, or the top of the insulator here, sometimes called the bat ears, where they tied the wire on, and were able to use that to bend around corners and stuff like that. That was licensed from Samuel Oakman in Boston, who filed the original patent. So everything Knowles sold had to have that patent date on it so that they wouldn't get sued. So the glass insulator, that's what it looked like, is about, I don't know, 8-9 inches long. I was going to bring one, but I didn't want it to break. United Airlines always loses my luggage. I didn't need to break that insulator after I put it all back together again. So the glass is about 5-6 inches tall, about 7-8 inches diameter. Nice old insulator in about 5.8 million pieces. So it's not. This makes it look pretty. So that's the glass insulator. The porcelain insulator was made by New Lexington High Voltage Porcelain Company in New Lexington, Ohio. And the reason we know that is a couple things. The manufacturing style and the glaze color match other insulators that are marked New Lexington, Ohio. We also know they were a job shop for C.S. Knowles. There's documentation around that. The insulator has, you can't really see on there, but it is stamped, in-use marked, patent June 17th, 1890, so they have the same patent date, and then has a manufacturing date stamped in there as well, most of which are about March or April of 1904, stamped in there. So again, I'm very fortunate to find enough pieces to put one back together again, so that's my example. Also, we know it's New Lexington because someone has actually located the original factory site out in New Lexington, Ohio, and found the old landfill, the dump site, where they threw all the bad insulators, and they found pieces of those insulators in the dump also. So we can confirm that was a New Lexington piece. So as you can see, they were obviously in a hurry to fill that order. They probably had weeks' notice. The two top skirts, those are as found, still cemented together, and they're skewed. They're not exactly level or parallel. And on top of that, the insulators are full of cracks. Just about everywhere on the line where I was able to find in New Lexington, it's in literally 6 million pieces. Looking at the pieces, the side profiles, very thin shells. As I said, they couldn't make thick porcelain reliably back then. So a lot of the pieces have flattened air bubbles in them. And then additionally, because again, they didn't understand material science so much, porcelain insulators, they will assemble 1, 2, 3, or 4 pieces of porcelain together with cement to make the desired size insulator for that voltage. So for 33,000 volts, it was a 3-piece insulator. And so the Portland cement expands and contracts at one rate, and the surrounding ceramic expands and contracts at a separate rate. It's like putting rock or water inside a cliff along I-84, wait for winter time, it freezes, cracks, and the rocks fall off the rock face, breaks apart the rock. Same thing with the ceramic insulators. Over time, that Portland cement expanding and contracting starts to crack the insulator radially. So just about every single insulator that I've seen along the rights of way I've been able to search, they're all cracked and falling apart, and most of them are just in pieces on the ground. So if you like jigsaw puzzles and you have the patience of a saint, you can put together your own insulator if you want to go hiking out in the woods there. So anyway, so that's what the glass and the porcelain, first and second generation insulators look like. So a lot of technical challenges. So brings us to the actual search. So I go down to Steep Rock, and I start walking with my little map there, and a buddy of mine came with me. He's walking up the river, I'm walking up the road, and invariably we come across people walking their dogs, and invariably the comments that I expected, because I grew up in Naugatuck, I know all about the flood of 1955. Oh, what are you looking for? I'm looking for an old power line. I think it ran through here, we're just trying to find some evidence. You're not going to find everything. Everything got washed out in 55. They had to repair the bridge down there, and this road was what? And I heard every tall tale going back 30 years. Yes, I know, thank you. But I'm going to search it anyway, see what I can find. So, not to be dissuaded, hiking up through the river, yeah, there are broken insulators in the river. So, okay, yes, we know something ran here. Thank God we can confirm that. Pieces mostly from Ohio brass, the third, better quality insulators all over there, marked with OB in the crown. One point in the riverbank there, what looks to be a chestnut stump. 99% of the pole sites I've been able to see, it's just a hole in the ground about 5 feet deep. Because these are untreated chestnut, they've dissolved, they've turned into dust, there's nothing left to find. I'll show you in a second some of the cross arms that we found. But so I think that's a stump. I don't see any roots or anything coming out of it, so that's still sitting in the riverbank. And then the coolest thing on the stretch, right before it jumped up the hill to Curtis Road, Buddy's walking in the river here, and it's like there's a concrete retaining wall sticking right out of the riverbank. I don't know if anyone here has been to Steep Rock and has seen that, but you know what it is now. It's the retaining wall for one of the poles. Like I said, I've been going there since '81. I'd never even seen that before, so that was a cool find. So just, 245s and a 180 sticking right out of here, right out of the riverbank, and lo and behold, on the top, there's a 5-foot deep hole at the top where the pole sat. So if anyone's from Steep Rock Association wants, they can put a plaque on that now that they know what that is, because that survived the flood of 55, so that's pretty neat. So jumping up the hillside towards Curtis Road, the stone wall starts, which is, I believe, the property boundary, because one side says Steep Rock Association, the other side says nothing. So on the unmarked side, right off the bat, there's pairs of cross arms on the poles, still bolted together, with iron pins still in them, all the way up the hillside to the corner. So that was a neat find right off the bat. And again, the cross arms were creosoted, the poles were not. So the poles have turned to dust, the cross arms are all still there. And kind of what clued me in a little bit better, Usually when they cut down a power line, the local farmers or people will come in the middle of the night, cut the poles up, drag them home, make a pole barn or fence posts out of them. I don't think that happened because, at least in one instance here, the cross arms are bolted together. The steel braces that keep the cross arm from lilting are still bolted together with a lag bolt, with a piece of wood still in the lag bolt. It's kind of hard to see there, but so that tells me they didn't cut the poles up and they didn't take the cross arms off. They just dropped it and it fell where it fell. On a couple other stretches, there was one entire couple, probably 5 or 6 poles length stretch where they cut the poles and obviously everything just fell on the ground. Everything was still in place except the pole had rotted away. The cross arm was in place, the braces were there, the insulators on the pins, the pole top pins still 5 feet up, bracket where the telephone wire was, everything was still in place except the pole was gone. So that was kind of neat. So evidence is out there. Very shocking to find this much stuff still on the ground in a decently traveled area, especially. So a couple of the Ohio brass insulators still on the ground, mostly broken now, but still there, you can see them. And then this is pretty neat to find, a pair of iron support stakes. The untreated chestnut, I'm sure by 1930 some of the poles were a little bit wobbly, to put it mildly, with the ground rot. So instead of replacing poles, it was cheaper to buy apparently 5-foot long iron stakes, pound them in on either side of the pole, bolt them together, and keep the pole from falling over for a few more years. So there was a set of those right up on a little rocky mound, right off one of the hiking trails behind the Indian Institute. So just sitting right there in the woods. And of the miles of blind I've walked so far, I've probably seen that about a dozen times. So that was a pretty popular solution for them at the time. They just bought iron support stakes. So again, just sitting right out there. And they're marked NEPSCO, I think it was, which was a company in Boston they purchased from. So pretty cool stuff. This is on the stone wall. This is what a new Lexington will look like if you happen to find one. Again, if you love crossword or jigsaw puzzles, go for it. Just hundreds of pieces. You can see it's split radially right out from the center of the insulator in all directions. So lots of that. Very pretty color glazes though. Nice mustardy, tannish blonde glaze, if you can find it. And then this is typically what the glass insulators would look like. I was able to locate pieces around a couple of the corner jogs in the line, and then a lot of the bottoms of hills. And most cases, the insulator would be split perfectly in half, in the ground, upside down. So you pull it up, they go perfectly together, except the crowns or the tops are all sheared off. So there's nothing on the top of the insulator. It's a headless insulator at that point. So after seeing this enough times, just about all of them were found like that. So after seeing that enough, my working theory is that the insulators failed mechanically, they didn't fail electrically. So at a corner, you can imagine the wires tied behind the crown of the insulator, relatively small piece of glass, and if something hits the wire, like a branch falls on it or something, it's going to shock the wire, crack the crown of the insulator, and eventually shear it off and fling it into the woods a couple hundred feet. And then of course, the power shorts down through the wood pin and then blows the insulator in half and throws it on the ground. That's my working theory. I can't prove it until they've developed time travel, but just an interesting thought. They were all found in that same exact condition. So I'm, like I said, guessing it was a mechanical failure. It wasn't an electrical failure.
How was the insulator attached to the pole?
The pole, you had the cross arm, and you had the wood pins, the wood dowels that stick out of the cross arm, and then the insulator would be screwed down onto one of those pins. So the insulators actually have a screw thread in the pinhole of the insulator. So
Wooden
just screws.
threads or glass threads?
Yeah, the glass insulator or the porcelain insulator has a thread turned right into the material itself. So it matched the thread on the pin and just screwed right on.
And then how are the lines attached to the insulators?
The line, let's go back to.
I know these days I think it's rubber that's up there.
Yeah, initially aluminum conductors, they used aluminum tie wires. So we did manage to find a few aluminum tie wires. Yeah, copper and aluminum don't go well together. So if you have a copper line, you have to use copper ties. Aluminum wire, you have to use aluminum ties because there's an electrochemical potential. CLMP, they started using jacketed conductors after Gloria in '85, and they used what they call an F-neck. It's a rubber piece that just bends over the crown, and the insulator snaps in and then holds it. Now they use, Kim, you want to talk about it? She works for Hendrix, which makes the insulators they use now, which is actually a plastic vise with 2 screws, and they drop the cable into the top of the insulator, screw the 2 screws, and then it vice grips it in place. That's what they use now. You can see them right out on the poles
The
out here.
screws being metal then?
No, everything's plastic.
Okay, all right.
The insulator's a
That
polymer,
makes sense.
and then I think it's a polyethylene screw, which it tightens itself, torques, and then snaps off to the right torque. So Kim can answer any questions you want about those insulators. So anyway, so right here, see there's a saddle on the top, and then the ears. If it's a straight run, the cable will sit right on the top of that saddle, and they'll tie the wire around those ears to hold it in place. If it's a corner, they'll put the cable on the back side of the side of there. So the insulator's behind, or in front of it. Cable's behind the insulator, and then they'll tie it around the insulator with the tie wire, like that. So that was that patent. That's why it was a novelty. You could tie it on the top, or you could tie it on the side. That was a brand new concept in 1890, apparently. So, all right, so in conclusion, how long did we go? That's 2 o'clock, okay. In conclusion, yes, there was an historic early power line that ran through Washington. In 1904, it was the longest distance line and the highest voltage line east of Denver, Colorado. So, still kind of good pride point here. Evidence is out there. If you want to go out and look for it, you know, you've got a few spots you can check now. If you go down to Steep Rock, you know, walk around some of the trails, you can see it right along some of the trails that go up there. If you see a wooden crossarm on the ground, you now know. If you see the concrete retaining wall section, which hopefully they'll put a plaque on, you know what that was from now. So it's out there if you want to go find it. If you're into geocaching, industrial archaeology, or just curious exploration. So I'll just say from a hobby perspective, since like I said, I've been collecting insulators about 40 years, both of those insulators, the glass prism and the New Lexington, neither one of those were known in the hobby until I started to find pieces of them. So that tells you a couple things. One, those insulators were a terrible design and they all exploded. You know, they didn't last and go to any other power lines. No one else wanted them. After that, said nope, not after what happened at Bulls Bridge. We don't want those insulators. So this is probably the only line that used those 2 insulators on there. So,
How long did the line last?
like I said, I'm speculating it came on in 1904, and I think it was dismantled around 1930. So, because by 34, the modern line had been built, which is the replacement. So, until Eversource pries open their library in Berlin, I'm probably not going to know any exact dates. So these insulators were never known. They haven't shown up at the elephant's trunk. They haven't shown up. There was a prism 20 years ago. There's a collector that found one up in an antique shop in Millerton, New York. That's it. And he didn't even know what the insulator was until last year when I saw it, and I just happened to see it. I'm like, holy cow, you have a prism. Oh, is that what that is? So, no one else has seen these insulators. So, I don't know if they're at tag sales, estate sales. They're not at the elephant's trunk. I've checked there enough times. So, again, if you live anywhere near this original route, or used to, or have friends or relatives that do, please go snooping around their barn, or their cellar, or their attic. See if they got any insulators, see if they have any old photos, family albums. If you're from Washington, you have a family photo album, pictures taken in Steep Rock around 1903 to 1930. I am dying to see if you have any with a power line running through the background of the picture. Just anything. The evidence out there other than these articles is just non-existent. At least I've not been able to find anything yet. So if you find anything, please make a copy of it, take a picture of it. I would love to see it. I'm sure Stephen would love to see it. They have the permanent History of Washington exhibit being redone right now. I'm sure you could donate the insulators to him. He'd be glad to put them in the exhibit. I also buy insulators. I'm just saying as a side note. But anyway.
First light on West Street in New Milford have a lot of pictures of the power plant when they were building it. Maybe they have some kind of information on where the lines went.
Okay, that's at the power plant where they have that?
No, it's at West Street in New Milford.
West Street in New Milford, okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to write that
It's
down.
First Light Power. Let's see. -354-8844.
Okay. I have to Google it when I get back to Chicago tonight, but yeah.
No, they have, I've seen many, many pictures of them building that plant, because I work there, and.
Okay.
And, I mean, from the time when they started building it, so they may have more information on where the lines are. But you won't get on from CMT or you gotta go to West Street.
Yeah, so they
Most
don't
likely,
want to
because they still have all the pictures and everything.
Okay, yes.
I live pretty near Bulls Ridge Road and in Kent, and we have a fair amount of information about the building of the canal and all that. I can't link that to this event. I mean, the water canal that carried the water down to Rocky River, I guess. This all was going on at the same time, right?
No,
Bulls Bridge was first in 1903. They started digging the canal and putting up the dam and building the powerhouse. Rocky River, on paper, it was started in 1917. Now,
Okay, but the canal down to the power plant, that was built at this
Canal.
same time.
at Bulls Bridge,
Great
yes.
number
From
of
the dam
Italian
and-
workers came to Kent, and, you know,
Dug-
we have lots of pictures of that being built.
Okay.
The Kent Historical Society.
Okay, that's good. There is that book. There's a lady, she's in Ohio, but her grandfather was the project engineer for the expansion of the plant in 1912. And she wrote a family history book and happened to include all of her grandmother's photos from the project. So I've got a lot of that too. And I'm sorry, I cannot remember the name of that book. But I'll give it to Stephen so he'll have it referenced there. But yeah, there's tons of photos that were in a drawer. And it's funny to read that book. Her grandmother wanted to donate the photos to Northeast Utilities as part of their archives, and so her grandmother did. And so she requested Northeast Utilities to get some of the photos back so she could write them for her book, use them in her book. And it's like, oh, we don't know what you're talking about. It's like, well, I'm not the only one with problems with Northeast or Eversource, whatever they call them. Anyway, yeah. Yes?
Two questions. Where is the power from that Bulls Bridge plant run now?
Now, it's if you drive over there, there's so many power lines over there right now. It's extremely hard to tell. In 34, they rerouted the end of the line from downtown Waterbury to Frostbridge substation. So if you drive up Route 8 through Waterville into the valley there before Thomaston, there's a huge substation there. That's where the line runs now. And it feeds right into the CLMP grid. I think that's where Stevenson Dam now feeds in also. There's some lower voltage lines that still come off Bulls Bridge. I think they tie into Rocky River, and I think they tie into like the huge substation up on the hill above Gaylordsville. So I think it ties into that, and then it goes into the grid from that point now. Yeah,
If
'cause-
you drive up 7 now, before you get to that piping and the
Mhm.
factory, if you take your first left before that place, will you find the top of the pipe and that building that was there in the Bulls Drive?
I'm not sure what's still, I know the gatehouse is still there up above. When you drive up 7, the bridge goes over the pipes. There's the big gatehouse that's still there at the end of the canal that feeds the water down through the penstock into the power plant.
Or that's a gatehouse?
Yeah.
Yeah, at the top, that's the gatehouse that just regulates the flow of water into the plant.
Where's that
Penstocks
water
have been
coming
replaced
from?
with fiberglass.
The
Okay.
lake?
I'm sorry?
Where does that water which collects come from? The lake?
No, that's the canal, and the dam is actually up almost into Kent, I believe, by the covered bridge.
By the covered bridge.
Yeah, and there's the dam there, and that canal starts there, and it runs evenly. It's level. So the river drops in elevation, the canal stays level till it gets to the gatehouse, and then goes down to generate the thrust for the turbines there, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes?
When there was problems with the electricity, would the trolleys actually stop in Waterbury? Would it reach that crisis level?
Yes, there were quite a few news accounts, what we would call a brownout today or a blackout. They'd be riding along the trolley, all of a sudden, yeah, you're stranded.
Did they ever have a problem with ice?
restricting the water flow down to the?
There were, yeah, some of the accounts, it wasn't just the power line that caused problems at the dam. There were accounts of mudslides into the canal, blocking the flow of water, icing of the dam. Of course, they expected that. The gates being stuck open and closed, motors burning out, fuses exploding, you name it. Like I said, it was baptism by fire. Biggest project had the biggest problems until they worked them all out and everyone else took advantage of that. So, yeah, lots of issues going forward. Yes?
When I looked on Wolf Bridge site, they mentioned that, later on, when they made the main gate, my land, Scoticook land, was flooded, but that's beside the point. When they made the main gate, was there an increase in the electric supply?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I haven't looked so much at the power plant itself other than the power line. I've only visited the site twice. Yeah, any problem with the gates, any problem with the canal, low water flow in the summer, that's a problem for every hydro plant. Obviously the voltage is gonna go down, which is why they started building steam plants again, and then, everything else, nuclear plant, everything else, because hydropower comes and goes with the tide, literally.
That one picture they had on your advertisement for this, they had some stacks there.
Yes.
Was that could they use steam if they wanted?
No,
Water levels down?
those stacks were, I forget what the technical name is. They're hammer? Standpipes, okay, so that
Oh.
balances the pressure of the water coming down, so the pressure has somewhere to go other than exploding out. So
Right.
that's kind of like a balancer for the steam, or for the water system. Yeah.
They're vents.
Vents, yeah.
If a unit gets tripped offline, the water comes out the top of it.
Oh,
So
okay,
it doesn't hammer the pipes.
okay. Yeah, they're pretty tall. They're pretty tall. They installed the second one in 1912 as part of that upgrade too, so. Yeah, I'm sorry, he was first.
No, I have a road map, if you wanna take a look at it, it shows you where Gaylordsville is and all that. And secondly, there's an article here that talks about those two, and water coming out of them at the top.
Yeah,
Because
anytime
if
the
they were-
unit trips off,
Yeah,
or the whole station trips off, the water has somewhere to go and it comes out those.
yeah.
Is your interest in insulators strictly sub-transmission pin-type insulators? Or are you?
I've got a little of everything. Yeah, telephone, telegraph, mostly power. My specialty is mostly early power stuff, just because it's so rare and so little of it has survived because of these types of things. Main focus is on there, but yeah, I've got a little bit of everything. If I can dig it, I keep it. I'm not a salesperson. If I find it in Connecticut, I hold on to it. Even though it's in Illinois, that's temporary. I'll be back here someday. But yeah, anything I found, I've held on to, just because it holds sentimental value for me, and plus it's local history, and I don't want to see that go to California or somewhere else. So yeah, but yeah, a little bit of everything. There's a few other collectors in the audience here, I suspect you might want to talk to also. But. Okay, anything else?
I just had a couple of tidbits I wanted to add to this good presentation. I worked for the telephone company for many years, and unbelievably coincidentally, I was given a job Friday to run a new cable in, of all places,
Bulls
the
Bridge.
French. Now, there may be an older lineman here that may know more about this than I do, but I couldn't get the telephone truck out of the garage fast enough. Almost got a speed thing getting up there, right? The hell with the telephone job. I want to get inside this place and learn as much as I can about it. And they told me they have not generated anything since May this year. No
Oh,
more.
really?
Nothing since May. And normally, yeah, there's no water. And normally they'll run 10 months out of the year to generate power. You know, but they have a lot of the equipment taken apart because they can work on it now.
Yeah,
And
PM. Yeah.
oh yeah, I mean,
There's 6 turbines in it.
that's right. Yeah,
Oh, really?
you know,
6?
Yeah. And the big gates to shut the water off, this gentleman probably knows more than I do about it, but.
They had to replace the pipes running down from the gates. I worked with him.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I mean, I couldn't find, you know, a better excuse to get in there and pepper them with questions. I have to go back in, but they told me, who you here to put the telephone cable in for? And Eversource. Oh, we're not Eversource. You're not. No, they're First Light.
Yeah.
Eversource is up there, a building on the property close by. Oh, well, let me keep asking questions about it now that I'm in here, you know? But, yeah, but I kinda knew that, you know, but I had an excuse to get in, so,
Yeah, I know, I guess after 9/11,
No, oh, hey, forget it.
You're not going
High
anywhere.
voltage,
Yeah,
blah,
forget
blah,
it.
blah, all this
Yeah.
stuff. They said, one of the guys was in there when they actually installed the cable, and they said something about having all this special outfit you have to have on. Wait a minute, there's no electricity being generated. Oh, yeah, you're right. Don't get too worried about it, because there's nothing going on. Anyway, that's a perspective, I guess. And that gatehouse you talked about, they're able to get in there and clean that all out, because there's no water.
Okay.
There's a big pile of brush there,
Yeah.
so what they do.
It's actually called the four-bay house, where the pipes, where the, water goes into the fence box. The gatehouses is usually referred to up by the covered bridge, there's 4 gates in that
Okay.
house. Allow the water into the canal.
So, I'm sorry, did you say you worked there?
Yeah.
Currently?
No, 31 years.
you didn't happen to see any piles of insulators on the property, did you?
We threw so many insulators away.
My uncle worked for CLMP in Oxford office, and every time they took insulators down, you know, there's certain crowds of big collectors following them around, and they would take them to the Seymour landfill, and the foreman would stay and watch them until they buried it under 50 feet of soil, and then they would leave. It's like, you're not getting any insulators, so yeah, CLMP's been a little bit different. Other utilities like Niagara and Mohawk, they just threw everything behind the substations. Down the bank, into the river, didn't matter, just dumped it all, so.
I have pictures of the inside of the powerhouse. Everybody wants to see it.
What was your uncle's name?
Chester Ford. Yeah, did you?
I've heard of him, but
Okay, yeah, he died in '86. Yeah, good time. Now he would tell stories, because you know United Illuminating's in Ansonia, Derby down there. UI would come up begging for cross arms, begging for cable, begging for insulators because they would run out of everything all the time. I guess UI didn't have any money. I don't know if they do now, but you can find that out for me. You live in Ansonia. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Thank you.